Thanks, Jenny, and very glad to be here amongst all of you. And we're going to start with a poll. So Brenda will pull that up. Okay, interesting results. So lots of general interest in clean cooking. And maybe some people for whom end user subsidies is something new, given the responses. And then there was a second question about discrete choice experiments, how familiar you are with discrete choice experiments. All right, so 33% never heard of them, 33% don't know, have heard of them, but don't know quite what they are, have a general sense, and we have very few people have actually implemented them. So this is the right place to be for the vast majority of you. But even for the one person who has implemented them, we hope we can offer new ways of making use of them. And that's going to be the topic of our webinar, Discrete Choice Experiments for End User Subsidies. And we will start that with a quick review of our research agenda. So our idea here was to test how discrete choice experiments, we'll call them DCEs, how we can use that approach to inform the selection, design, and delivery of clean cooking end user subsidies. Through that, we'll also generate insights on customer decision making. So there's two aspects. One is this testing a methodology, and the other is from the test of that methodology, getting some insights on consumer behaviors. We'll talk about what is a end user subsidy, since the poll showed the vast majority of you are not yet using them for clean cooking. Same for discrete choice experiment. We'll have a little bit of a primer on that. We'll talk about our research setup, provide some insights on our analysis, our qualitative and survey findings, and then dive into our biggest section, which will be our DCE section, and then summarize with a few takeaways. So, what are end user subsidies? So, an end user subsidy, the way we'll be using the term today, it seeks to reduce the cost of a product or service to the customer to specifically address an issue of affordability. So it really aims at setting a cost that's affordable. So unlike a demand side subsidy, so if you provide a grant to an enterprise or something, they can, if they want, reduce the price in the end, but they don't have to. And an end user subsidy really seeks to move that price, the needle on the price that the customer sees at the point of purchase. So that's how it's different. This is a chart from a great GOGLA publication on end user subsidies that I recommend you download and read. It just shows the different types of subsidies. On the left, you have general sort of enabling environment subsidies, like for standards and consumer protection. In the middle are supply side subsidies. That's probably what we're all more familiar with. So grants or financing facilities to firms, or even results-based financing to enterprises. And then on the right, we have end user subsidies, which can be vouchers, discounts, cash transfers, can be done directly to the customer from a program, or it can be through the company that's distributing whatever goods. So in clean cooking, there are very few, and they're kind of novel. And so that's also why we have the end user subsidy lab. They're a little more common in off-grid solar.
Jean-Louis, sorry to interrupt, but I don't see your screen.
Ah,
So if you're sharing your screen, I don't see it.
ah.
I can see it.
You can see it, Brenda?
Oh, you can.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Something with mine then.
Okay. John, can you see the screen?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And if anybody else cannot see it, maybe provide comments. Maybe I'll stop share and reshare. So great framework or very useful framework from the GOGLA report from a few years ago, again, on different types of markets. So on the horizontal axis, you have on the left side, commercial markets that are within commercial reach. So you can think of firm being in an urban area that's very dense. And then on the right, markets that are not within commercial reach of an enterprise. And then on the vertical axis, on the top, you can find, markets where everyone can afford whatever product you're selling. And at the bottom, in this case, it's off-grid solar. And then the bottom, people are unable to afford. So when everyone's able to afford and you have a firm that's a market that's within commercial reach of a firm, there's no real reason for a subsidy. It's a commercial market and you just let the market grow and let things happen. If you move to the bottom left corner, you may have a market which is within geographical reach, but maybe the product is not affordable to a certain segment of the population. And that's where you would want to use end user subsidies as your sort of tool of choice for affordability. And then if you move to the right, to the lower right side, if a market is not within commercial reach of a company or doesn't have or cannot afford it, so think of rural markets or some other types of markets, or for a completely novel product, maybe that's too expensive, then you would combine supply side and end user subsidies. So one takeaway from the end user subsidy toolkit was that subsidies need to be designed responsibly, and that's what we've sought to do with the discrete choice experiment approach. So we want them to be effective in reaching the poor. And so what we sought to do was to look at what are the features of the subsidy that will make them adopted, because you can have a subsidy, but maybe no one wants it because it's just not designed in a way that's conducive to people adopting the subsidy and the cook stove. And you also want it to be efficient and minimize distortion. So if you over subsidize things, it's not efficient because you're using a lot of your budget, of your program budget, and it also has a more of a distortionary effect on the market. So you don't want to over subsidize things for people who would be willing to buy and able to afford whatever it is you have. So being responsible is kind of, I guess, the key word that catches all of these things together. So now we're going to go on to what is a discrete choice experiment, and John will take over that section for a primer that I hope will be helpful to all of you.
Yeah. So from here, we're going to talk about what are we talking about here, when and why. What is the actual true predictive accuracy when we cast it into a market condition on a hypothetical, which is what we create in a survey environment. So first, let's talk about what they are. So it's very simply, it's a methodology used within research. Usually, for our purposes, it's going to be within survey research or experimental research in the field. And what we're trying to do is quantify how folks in the market make choices between different alternatives. So we're giving participants a set of hypothetical scenarios. They may exist, they may not exist. Some may exist in the market, they may be observable, and then we might be testing something that doesn't exist yet in the market. And what we're trying to do is quantify between two or more options, a keyword here being the alternatives. So you might have some base and then a series of alternatives. And these packages are defined by specific attributes in the levels. And what we do based on the series of choices that folks make, we can decompose those and say which attributes are the most influential in decision, and then what levels are most impactful. And then essentially what we're getting into is the lens of how individuals within a marketplace make choices. So they're going to give us insights into attribute importance, the features that are most impactful in decision making, trade-offs, a key critical factor. It's pretty easy to ask folks, what they're willing to pay for something, but it's all conditional, right? I might be willing to pay $100 for something until you tell me I could pay $150 for something that I have a much greater value for. We can look at preference heterogeneity. So in other words, how we actually quantify differences between subgroups. It might be a younger, older audience. It might be urban, rural. We're going to see kind of how that mix looks a little bit later in our findings here. And then we're going to forecast how people might respond to some new product, service, or a policy that might go embedded. Go ahead, next slide. So these were created in the 60s and 70s. They go all the way back a number of years by economists and policymakers. What we have is these real limitations of traditional demand models. They were usually continuous and aggregate, made it difficult to analyze situations where people had to choose between discrete options. So, for example, one very prominent in my area in Chicago in the United States is how do people decide between driving a car, taking a bus, or using a train for a commute? These are mutually exclusive. You can do both, but that would depend on really on what your commute looks like. But assuming they were all held equal because they are mutually exclusive, these are discrete choices. So what we want to do is look at how people evaluate choices based on the cost, the time, convenience, access to that transportation, total time. Expanded in the 1960s into the 70s by Daniel McFadden, who ended up winning a Nobel Prize in this exact methodology. He formalized the concept by looking at this idea of utility where deterministic or the observable and random, the unobservable components intersect. So it provided this really stringent mathematical formula and framework to model choices between these alternatives. So what we did was we addressed then the inherent randomness and variability and how humans make decisions. So now we can actually model choice behavior more realistically. So early applications then start rolling into urban transportation planning and other levels of policy. Governments and researchers were needing to forecast the demand for new transportation options because of how more or less how much structural investment, not only in money, but in time and what our citizens have to give up in terms of the amount of time it takes to invest in that infrastructure. So in the seminal work, McFadden was able to study how commuters were choosing between these different modes of transportation, and it enabled cities to plan infrastructure around it. So now what we've done, McFadden did all of that largely in observing these and then take that into an experiment level of world. So we went from revealed preferences into stated preferences. So now what we had done before was observe, but now we're actually allowed to take stated preferences in experimental design and see where respondents could expand their preferences for non-existent or future alternatives. So new product development, policy planning, this is really where this took off. And now we have this ability to quantify trade-offs in policy decisions and marketing strategy and how we allocate resources. Go on the next slide. So the benefits here, we can actually mimic a real world scenario where people choose between options. So we can actually see from an observational context what is real rather than just monadically asking somebody what they would be willing to pay when we know that's not necessarily market realistic. We can quantify the trade-offs, how much people value different attributes and how they make them, whether they would be willing to pay more for something they find greater value, something they would not be willing to trade value up to a certain level. Again, getting at preference heterogeneity, I already hit on that earlier, but also the predictive power. We can predict how people will respond to new markets, to new products within markets, policies or services based on their choices. We have incredible flexibility with doing this. You can do this across healthcare, marketing, transport, environment, but we've also seen some of these more seminal studies actually were able to build in adjacency markets and say, hey, this is what we learned in this vertical. We can actually borrow from that and apply that if our resources are depleted to be able to infer what we might learn from a metadata standpoint. And then we can actually capture willingness to pay estimation. So it allows for our calculation of monetary values that people place on specific attributes, but not just in their willingness to pay, also their willingness to give up in certain realms. Are you willing to take a higher interest rate if I can take away PMI, something of that nature? What would that look like? So next slide. I already hit on a lot of this, but this goes all the way back to the 1920s and how we were getting into economic and psychological theories of choice. Random utility theory became very prominent in the 1960s, where it really started to take off from what I spoke to in the 70s and 80s and the observations of transportation and different components of marketing. This is really heavy in more or less the hospitality world. We get into experimental design where we can actually take to market some idea and apply some rigorous statistical principles in order to derive how markets make decisions. Where it really exploded, though, beyond just the computing power in the 80s and into the 90s, is when now we have the ability to reach much broader audiences via online surveys or being able to get in the field, properly identify the right participant respondent mix. So we've been able to really see a healthy application in health economics where we're assessing preferences for healthcare interventions, insurance plans, medical services, marketing and product design, looking at trade-offs between product features and pricing, even environmental economics, valuing non-market goods like ecosystem services and conservation policies. Transportation planning, I already hit on a great deal, but public policy, gauging citizen preferences for policy changes. And then the advances in technology with not just the online surveys, but our ability to really scale out what online surveys can do. I've actually, over the last 10 years or so, been able to actually embed actuarial algorithms into studies about health insurance, about lending, about other factors within risk at the, let's say, at the college application level, being able to quantify someone who has a high level merit and with a high mixed need, their probability to enroll in a certain college at a certain level and what offers might be of interest. So we're going to the next. Already hit on all of these, but just some quick examples. Looking at healthcare plans with varying cost coverage and wait times in health economics, marketing and product design, maybe a car manufacturer designing a new model based on preferences, fuel efficiency, price, and safety. Ford has really been a big proponent of this over the last 40 years. Transportation planning, already spoke to a lot of this, environmental economics, and public policy. So let's look real quick next at the predictive power. So we have a few different methods here. We found in studies and then extensive observation when we cast out testing product or concept with trade-offs into the market, discrete choice tends to be the strongest predictive power because we're capturing trade-offs between attributes, choices in hypothetical or real-world scenarios, whether we're testing them in a survey environment or observing them. And it's based on highly computational, robust statistical models and stronger for multi-attribute decision making. So how to optimize the blend of what your product or product portfolio will look like. Some other options, best worst scaling is good. You can actually apply this as a form of discrete choice, but where you trade off is you're only looking at single attribute. You're not looking at the combination of these. So that takes away from its ability to really optimize what a product looks like, and it takes away from the realistic nature of the market. Conjoint, very similar context. For product design, it's really more about consumer preference rather than choice, and it takes away some of our ability to actually predict choice when it comes to something that is highly robust, and it's more so for market share estimation. So it does have that capability to do that with something like a choice-based conjoint. Revealed preference, you've got moderate strength. It is based on real-world choices, but they're not great for evaluating newer hypothetical scenarios. So it's really only good for what we can observe or test that's currently within market. So you really only limit to the existing. Ranking and rating scales gets highly biased. Everything is important or nothing is important kind of a situation. It's not really reflective of actual choice behavior. And then contingent valuation is only a single hypothetical scenario. These all have their places. They all have, obviously we're not trying to put a method before a problem, but if your problem really is about looking at trade-offs, consumer choice, and market simulation, DC is really where we want to be. And then finally, a few peer-reviewed studies we found in healthcare, public health, And then another area of public health find that the predictive accuracy is remarkably high, especially in this first study found that the sensitivity, which is the probability that a market will make the choice, is extremely high, 88%. Specificity is lower. This is not uncommon in survey research. It's that Anna Karenina principle I talk about, where all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It's pretty clear to predict how somebody will likely to be to make a decision, but ones that don't make the decision kind of have an amalgam of balance as to why they didn't enter the market. So that's not uncommon. We're seeing anywhere from 88 down to 76% predictive accuracy. So we know that we're performing at a very high level when it comes to casting out to a market. So we know we've got something that's going to work.
Thanks, John, for that. Great primer on DCEs. So moving on to our research setup, what we actually did with DCEs. So we conducted experiments in 2 locations in Kenya. One was Nairobi and the other was Isiolo. And the idea was to have one urban versus one more rural area to see if we could spot differences and give a little more color to how to interpret customer behavior. Here's a picture of Isiolo on the screen. The objective, maybe to restate, was at the broader level, sort of the end goal was to help the community of organizations, people working on end user subsidies, here specifically for clean cooking, but this is, I think the methods and findings can be pretty much generalized to other sectors. But in an effort to design responsible subsidies. And so we did this by testing a DCE approach to understand the choice process of end users in clean cooking markets. But we also, by doing that, we also generated some interesting insights that can also inform how future end user subsidies are designed. So the methodology, we started qualitative interviews. The reason why is that we wanted to make sure we posed the right sort of discrete choice sort of questions, and we set up the problem in the right way. We followed the qualitative interviews with surveys that also helped us understand demographics, people's familiarity with subsidies, with the clean cooking, with everything around that, the price, the availability, the access to fuels, for example, and also their knowledge of the different subsidy instruments and the attributes and of clean cooking. So just trying to get a good picture of the customer. And the reason is, I'll show you later, we actually did a bit of segmentation to understand how people in different categories reacted differently in terms of their choices. And then we did our DCEs. And then this data was collected by an enterprise called Busara in Kenya. Okay, so to start with the qualitative interviews, basically roughly 50-50 between Nairobi and Isiolo, mostly women, given that they are the prime users of clean cooking solutions. We tried to understand and unpack decisions around finances, who takes the decisions, and on clean cooking, what are their barriers, what are the factors promoting clean cooking, and what's their experience with clean cooking. So again, just very open-ended, qualitative, the idea being to inform the more quantitative work that we did later. The survey and discrete choice experiments, here's an example of the field office in Isiolo. So we had to set up a field office because just the density is low, so we had to get people to come. And you can see people on these computers doing the discrete choice experiments and doing the surveys. In Nairobi, it was there was no field office because it's dense, so it could be just door to door and with tablets. So here's the choice set for the discrete choice experiments. So as John mentioned, discrete choice experiments aim to look at various attributes and how they basically lead to a higher or lower probability of someone choosing a given bundle. So in ECOLO, we focused on improved cook stoves, and we varied the price from 500 to 750 shillings. In Nairobi, we focused on gas stoves, LPG, and we varied the price from 5,500 to 7,500. And then we experimented with different subsidy delivery modalities with cash transfer. So basically, you give someone cash, and that is meant to basically buy or subsidize part of a cook stove that is, priced by the retailer at full price. You give them a discount, so everyone, the consumer goes to the retailer and they see sort of 15% off, 50% off. So that's the other option. And then you can also give them a voucher, which is basically a ticket, a piece of paper that tells them you will get 15% off or 50% off if you take this to the retailer and buy this stove or a stove. So those were the three options. And then in terms of the payment method, we also wanted to experiment between financing, so with microloans, and a lump sum, which means you just give the cash upfront or the voucher or whatever it is. The microloan is basically a 4-month repayment. And then subsidies, we experimented with different subsidy levels, anything from 20% to 80%. So this is what after filling up the sort of survey questions about demographics and households, etc., and knowledge, and there was also some framing questions, the participants saw a version of this on their screen where they saw 3 choices. So they see the 3 columns on the right, choice 1, 2, 3, and they are asked which choice they would like to purchase. And so they have a choice. Choice 1 is a stove priced at 750 shillings. If you go down, you'll see that the subsidy is given as a cash transfer, and it's worth 450 shillings. And then they get to pay with a microloan, and it tells you how much. And then the second one is less expensive, but you have a discount instead of having a cash transfer, and it's for a different amount. And then it's a microloan as well. And then on the right, you have a different combination. So basically, the way it works is that participants of the survey of the discrete choice experiment have a number of choice sets. So they basically, and they have to pick a choice or no choice at all if they don't want to buy any of these over and over and over again, so that basically we get enough data. And then if you scale that to hundreds of participants, and then you get enough data that you can figure out the probability that a given factor increased basically the probability of something being selected above what a random probability would have been. So let's say that everyone picks whatever, whenever the price is 750, everyone picks that. So that's sort of an extreme situation where you would know a price of 750 is basically moving the needle and then significantly increasing the probability. Of course, it's not only one factor. You have many, many moving parts. But that's the point of this DCE methodology, is that it allows you to tweak all these things at the same time through this approach. So a little bit about the demographics. In Nairobi, mostly female participants, mostly half with primary school education. The types of fuel, none of them were LPG users. So we were trying to get to non-LPG users to see what would get them to basically adopt LPG. So it was kerosene and charcoal. Roughly half were connected to the electric grid. Some data points on the upper right about income, but that's not from a survey, because we know there are biases in responding to income. So that relies on basically the Kenya Revenue Authority data. For ECOLO, more females than males. Again, primary school. Here, very different fuels, so firewood and charcoal. Again, we didn't, and what we focused on is improved wood stoves. Again, a lot less connected to the grid here, so 31%. And that's, it's a bit overwhelming to see all this demographics, but that's just gives you a snapshot of what it is. So very quick section on qualitative analysis and survey findings. The reason it's going to be quick is that we used a lot of the surveying findings in helping us interpret the results of the DCE. So it's not much it's not much help to just show them on their own, but I'm going to take you through a few that are interesting. So the first step we did was the qualitative interviews. So and the thing is also, if you were doing this constantly, if you had a program and you kept doing end user subsidies, you probably wouldn't have to do these qualitative interviews each time, because you just have gotten a sense of what the main sort of questions and hypotheses are. And so you wouldn't have to do this over and over again. But this is because we're testing a new approach. So financial constraints came out as a primary barrier to adoption. Some participants expressed preferences over installments, others for one-off payments. Affordability also came into play when it came to fuel. So the subsidies we experimented with are on the stove, not on the fuel. So that's important and interesting, because we're not subsidizing that. So interesting to see if that has an effect. But also the availability and convenience of stove usage were a factor. Accessibility and familiarity led to people preferring traditional stoves. So as expected, there were some concerns with safety, predominantly around LPG. And then, however, there was widespread interest or stated interest in adopting clean cooking. It was seen as fast to cook with, durable, easy to use, and seemed to improve the air quality. So I'll give you a little bit in terms of our survey findings. I think this was really interesting, and you'll see this coming up again across this presentation. In Isiolo, we had a high rate of people who stated that the improved wood stoves were affordable. So 46% said they were very affordable. So improved wood stoves are the ones that we're trying to get to subsidize because we don't think they're adopted enough. And then if you add that with the somewhat affordable, you're going to get almost 2/3 of people. So it sort of brings into question, okay, do you really need a subsidy if 2/3 of people already think they're somewhat or very affordable, but not buying them? So the picture was more mixed in Nairobi, where we had a peak maybe at 31%, finding them difficult to afford. So a little more convincing to do subsidies in Nairobi. But in either case, in Isiolo, there wasn't existing very much sort of, improved or clean cooking adoption. So sort of adds a little question mark to that finding. When we asked people about their familiarity and knowledge of improved cook stove, what's interesting is, to me, the most interesting is the contradiction with the row on the bottom. So if you ask people in Isiolo if they know the cost of improved cook stove, 90% say no, but actually, if you look the slide before, 2/3 said that it was somewhat or very affordable. So there's a contradiction there. In Nairobi, they also state that they do not know the cost. However, in Nairobi, if you look at the rows on the top, people seem to be very familiar at 89%, and then 63% know where to buy one. Less familiarity, but still at 61% in Isiolo, if you look at the column in the middle, and then where to buy one, yes, only 15%. And I'll be referring to these later also in the presentation. So discrete choice experiment findings. What did we actually get beyond the survey when we did the experiment? Here's sort of a highest level possible snapshot of the findings. This is basically reflecting the importance of the different attributes to basically people's choice of selection of a bundle of cook stove and subsidy. And you can see that the subsidy had the most effect both in Isiolo and Nairobi, much more in Nairobi than the price. So the subsidy and the price, I mean, it's almost the same. It's the same thing. It's money, right? So they should be the same. But basically, this is telling us that showing people what they save seems to matter more than the actual overall price. In Isiolo, the price mattered more than in Nairobi, but still less than the subsidy. So subsidy seemed to be the most important factor. The modality in terms of cash transfer versus discount or voucher had less effect on people's decision, and in financing as well. We're going to be showing you some more complicated curves. So this was the highest level, most simplest way of viewing the results. But I'm going to hand it over to John to give you a little bit of a tutorial on how to read the curves, because it's not incredibly intuitive.
Yeah, so first note, what you saw in the prior, that's the derived importance that comes out of what we refer to here as utility curve. So basically what it's showing is the level of impact that each of these attributes have on the overall choice. So we saw that subsidy was around 60% over on the aggregate, 57, 65, right? So you're about, close to about 2/3, on one side of the house. What that's really showing you is the strong distribution of the level of preference, or in our case, choice probability, that comes out of those varying subsidy levels. So what we have here is what we call a utility curve, and it in the structure of how a lot of marketing studies work, a utility curve is just a mathematical derivative for people's preferences in the level of satisfaction, or as it's referred to in the economics world, the level of happiness that I derive from an attribute and its level at that respective level, and then our ability to combine them helps us see what might optimize a product when we get there, and we'll see what the actual results look like when we put them together. So a utility curve is our ability to see visually how changes in a particular attribute is impacting the total. So some choice in a car model, for example, just to kind of keep it relatively simple, it might show that increasing fuel efficiency, which is your miles per gallon, affects the utility a consumer perceives. I mean, nobody wants to overpay for gas, so I would think the more efficient your vehicle is, the more happy I am with it. So we're going to see that they have different shapes, linear, and different slopes, linear, nonlinear. And what we've done here is we've converted, for our purposes, the utility curve has become a distribution in the spread of our choice probability within the sets that we offered. So the next slide, and I'll note too, the graph in each of these over the next 4 or 5 are the same graph, just to kind of keep it consistent so you can see overall. So the way to interpret it, we're looking at 4 things. So slope is the slope of the curve is going to tell you the rate at which utility changes as the attribute changes. So if it's positive, it means the increase in the attribute increases utility. So the more discount we give you, obviously we're going to expect that, intuitively obvious to the casual observer, that somebody's going to have a greater preference for that. The key question, though, once we really get down to something at marginal level, is where are the critical lifts, which is what we consider thresholds. So a threshold, there may be a point where that curve levels off or plateaus, or that beyond a certain point, it increases the attribute, no longer impacts. But we might also see via steepness that a steeper slope indicates that the attribute has a stronger impact on utility. If it's flat, it indicates the attribute has a weaker impact. So we see modalities relatively toward the base rate. Subsidy, not so much, right? We see some pretty significant lifts. And I'm going to talk about what these thresholds mean in a second here. And then the shape. So linear curves suggest a constant rate of change. If it's concave, we've got some level of diminishing returns. We don't quite see that here as much as slope. We're going to see it later. Each additional unit adds less utility if it's concave, but if it's convex, we've got increasing returns, suggesting that each additional utility adds more. Next slide. So we're going to see several different types of curves in our overall analysis. So for our purposes, the first is an S-curve. This is typical when you're plotting choice probability against attributes like price or quality, or discount, which is essentially a factor of what my net price is going to be, right? So initially, changes in that attribute might not impact the choice probability as much, but once you get to this level of critical range, the probability changes rapidly. So now we have a steeper part of the curve. So take a look at subsidy level here. So at subsidy level, the lift from 20% to 40% is minimal, right? We're below the loss threshold, so essentially meaning our base rate. If we cast the market out to randomly select something, that would be our base rate. But if you now reduce the subsidy to 20%, you have completely lost me. At 40%, you're starting to gain me, and then at 60%, I'm now above that critical threshold. So we see the greatest lift ultimately, though, in that S curve is from 40 to 60. You're hovering the loss threshold, and you're at 60, you're above the gain threshold. We see this a lot. In consumer choice, it's goal gradient. When you get somebody to the halfway mark and feel like they have gotten to the 50% plus discount, and we've got something we strongly like. So next, we're going to see linear curves on next slide. So if the relationship between utility and the attribute is approximately relatively linear, then the choice probability might change more consistently. So we're going to see this with price. Price looks about as linear as any curve I've seen. Delivery method, despite the fact that those are mutually exclusive options, whereas price is more of a sliding scale. Interesting to see this as well. But with price, we see the marginal utility decline, which is that change in utility from one level to the next interval. We see it's about equal from low to moderate as it is moderate to high. It's pretty much the same function. And it is worth noting this is not the same as price elasticity, although it does look fairly close. They are mutually exclusive concepts. We also see here some steep slopes with respect to subsidy level and strong with delivery. We see modalities concave and no level is fairly above the base rate. So we would say and argue that modality would be an indifferent feature, whereas your delivery method of a financing versus a lump sum payout, our gain versus loss threshold is significant there. And then finally, on the next slide, we see threshold effects. I alluded to this. I actually spoke to it in fair detail on the first slide here when we got into this. But what it suggests is that there's a specific attribute where levels have a significant change, notably statistically, noted by here in the gain threshold and the loss threshold, which is that likelihood of choosing an alternative when it's present. So, for instance, when we lower a product's price below a certain point, it might make it suddenly more likely to be chosen. There might be that key inflection point where, okay, you put it at $150 versus $200 versus $175, $150 might be the tipping point in the market. We're going to see this come out in net price here. So the gain threshold is your green bar. Anything above that would be considered a statistically significant gain in choice probability within the market from the base rate, which is the rate at which someone might choose a product option completely at random. Whereas your loss is you've got a statistically significant loss in the probability from the base rate, again, the rate at which someone might choose a product option at random. So I think we want to stop for any questions and interpretation, right? Because I think we want to make sure that folks are kind of following along where we are.
No questions?
Awesome.
All right, great. Thanks, John. So moving on to the next slide. So here what we've done is we've taken the choice probabilities, but we've plotted them as a net price. So it goes from, sorry, these dollar signs should be Kenyan shillings, but that's a typo. So the probability choice, the same as you saw in the previous utility graphs on the vertical axis, and then the net price being the price minus the subsidy. So the price that the retailer puts up on the tag minus the subsidy is what you see on the horizontal axis. So a perfectly rational customer would say, if the perfectly rational population, would show more of a linear relationship, right? So the lower the net price, the higher the probability that people should choose that option. However, you see something strange going on the left. You see a bump coming up and then down and then up again, which means actually the probability of the selecting something at a net price, the bundle at a net price of 2,200 is less than that of 2,600, which doesn't make sense rationally. But the key here is that people are not looking at the net price. People don't think in net prices. They think in terms of subsidies and prices, and they make up their minds in terms of the effect that each has on their sort of decision making. So, and we saw subsidy had a bigger effect than price, and so that might be something that's happening. If you unpack that a little bit more, let's look at what those dots mean. So if you look at the center dot under 2,600, that's a 60% subsidy on the 6,500 Kenyan shilling cook stove. So that's a subsidy of $30 per stove. And so if you had a program that's $1 million subsidy program, it would be able to buy you 33,366 cook stoves. If you go all the way to the left, that point there is an 80% subsidy on a 5,500 Kenyan shilling cook stove. But the probability is almost the same that the customer will choose that. But the subsidy is higher per cook stove because you have a higher subsidy of 80%. So it ends up being $34. And so if you set that 80% subsidy on a 5,500 cook stove, 5,500 shilling cook stove, your $1 million would only buy you 29,577. So what this is telling you is that it's better to be at the 60% mark and to aim for these more expensive 6,500 shilling cook stoves than to be on the left, and you'll be able to go much further with your money than if you're spending it on 80%. So it's not intuitive, but that's kind of what DCEs are trying to get to, is customers sort of behaviors that don't necessarily look rational when we haven't unpacked them completely. Here's a little more unpacking even of that choice. So this is a bit overwhelming, but let's take time to go through it because this is really interesting. So on the left hand side, you have the price. So from lower to higher. On the bottom, you have the modality. So cash transfer, discounting, and voucher. And then on the top, subsidy. On the right, delivery. So what these numbers are, they're your choice probabilities for each basically combination. So on the upper left, a low price with a 20% subsidy and a cash transfer gives you a 2% choice probability. And that's very low. That's very, very much low, your lowest threshold. And so that's a risk. So you don't want to set that subsidy level and with a cash transfer and a low price, because that means people will not be buying your cook stove. So red is bad. Red is risk. It's below that threshold. Green is good. Green is an opportunity. It's above that threshold. And so you see most of the green around discounts and vouchers. So that means people have a preference for discounts and vouchers over cash. If you kind of just squint and look at the colors like that. If you look more closely, there's actually not that much of a difference between discounts and vouchers. If you look at the numbers, they're almost the same in the 60 and 80% column. So basically what this is saying is people don't like cash transfers. They like something else, but not cash transfers, in this case, in discounts and vouchers. This also shows you that the green is where you have 60 and 80% subsidies. So that means that below 60% subsidies, you're likely not to get people to adopt. When you move above the 60%, you're likely to hit this point where what we saw on the graph, where you're getting people to move. On financing, it seems to make a difference. So if you look at the upper right, for example, at 80% subsidy and a low price, it moves you from 51.8 probability to 62.3. So that's a good 10% plus bump. But it's moving you from green to green. So maybe not that helpful. It seems to be helpful in the 60% mark, where it moves you from black to green under various cases. And so basically it acts and brings you closer to that tipping point where you're willing to make that purchase. But again, if it depends on what subsidy level you're setting. So, and it also depends of how expensive, someone has to manage the financing scheme, probably, there's a lot of overhead and transaction costs involved. So it depends on your cost benefit and whether you want to do that, but it's not a given that you absolutely need that all the time. Okay, so basically, a net kind of takeaway from this is people don't think in net prices. Another one is, as part of that, is that subsidies between 60 and 80% get the most bang for the buck. After 80% doesn't seem like you're getting much returns. And even between 60 and 80, you may have a dip where you're getting, you're going the opposite direction. The retail price and the subsidy have independent effects on people's decision making. So they don't just add the two or subtract one from the other to decide. They kind of each play a role in people's brains that's independent. And then decreasing the price beyond a certain threshold the net price doesn't really lead to meaningful adoption gains. So the idea is to find an optimal kind of combination of retail price and subsidy. Maybe moving on to some of the survey findings. So this is interesting because it allows us to kind of validate the DCEs. So in the survey, we actually asked people to rank their preferred modality and delivery methods. And we also asked them how familiar they were with different modalities and delivery methods. Everyone, you see the second column in both tables, people are very familiar or claim to be very familiar with all these different modalities and delivery methods. Whether they've used them or not, a little more mixed, but more and less experience with vouchers, but a lot of experience with discounts and microfinance. But interestingly, the top choice is vouchers here. So you get 39% in Nairobi who have cited vouchers as being their number one preferred kind of modality. And then people, 70%, so an overwhelming majority prefers loans. So that actually agrees with that's consistent with the results we saw from the DCE. We found that loans made a difference. And we did find that, vouchers and discounts made a difference. We didn't really find that huge amount of difference between vouchers and discounts, but they were much preferred to cash transfers. And I'll give you a preview, although the findings are consistent here across the survey, the rank preference method and the DCE. In ECOLO, they are not at all. So again, ranked preference to be taken with a grain of salt, and that's why DCE is more of a tool of choice, but I'll get to that. So ECOLO, what we see here is the curves are different. They're more linear, so you're further from that sort of threshold where increasing or decreasing price and subsidy doesn't make a difference. People are more price sensitive, so you see the price curve steeper and really getting you above that gain threshold. And you see also the modality is pretty flat and different. The shape of the curve is different than we had in the urban area. Looking at the net prices, here you see again something strange happening on the left. When you decrease you get to this net price of 240, where people, start to want to buy, adopt your subsidy and cook stove, your subsidized cook stove more. But then when you move to the left, it actually goes down. You decrease the probability. So even though the net price is going down, and you would think people would like a lower net price, your probability and your preference for that goes down, and then it goes back up. So maybe looking a little more at what's happening here. So if you take the dot, so what we're looking for as subsidy designers is the lowest possible subsidy that gives you a high sort of probability of adoption. And that's that dot around the $200 net price mark, which corresponds to a 60% subsidy on a 500 shilling improved wood stove. That's basically a net subsidy of $2.31 per cook stoves. And if you had $1 million for a subsidy program, that would give you 432,900 cook stoves. If you go all the way to the left, that point corresponds to an 80% subsidy on a 500 shilling cook stove. That's a higher subsidy per cook stove of $3.08, and that gives you 100,000 fewer cook stoves. So basically, the point is you can reach a lot more if you do these computations, and if you use DCEs, you may be able to reach a lot more people for less money by being able to set your subsidy at the optimal level. So it's more efficient a tool. unpacking a little bit Isiolo here, again, there's a preference here for discounts over cash, but people don't seem to dislike cash as much as they would in Nairobi. But you see what's interesting with discounts is that it takes you to a place where with a 40% subsidy, you can actually make a difference, which is interesting because that means you can you can have a lower subsidy and reach more people. What's also interesting here is the financing. So again, if you compare lump sum and financing across, it does give you a bump. But then again, not if you're using discounts, you actually don't really need financing. It's a small bump, and if you're at in some cases it gives you a tipping point, but it's not. It's very small. It's not like necessary in a way. So looking at ranked preferences, so what people ranked before they did the discrete choice experiment, how they ranked these different things. So most people in Isiolo, 53%, so not most, maybe a little more than the majority, preferred cash transfers. So one would have predicted that one could have actually gotten more adoption with cash transfers, but that's not what we saw in the actually discrete choice experiments. So that means if you had just stopped and at your rank preference and asked people, you may have made the wrong choice of modality. And so that again emphasizes the value of a DCE over just stopping at a rank preference tool. And then on microfinance loan versus upfront payment, you have 76%, so huge majority preferred a loan. Again, it seemed to matter, but it sort of made a small bump and not consistently across all the instruments. And so again, question mark as to whether, it's useful enough to be implemented depending on the cost benefit. But again, you wouldn't have been able to capture that in just a rank preference approach. And so the DCE there was useful. So financing and payment modality effects, maybe just to summarize, discounts and vouchers are preferred over cash, but the gains are small. So it's not like obvious that you need to use them depending on the cost. So in Nairobi, microloans have a tipping point effect when they're offered with moderate to high subsidies. And in Isiolo, a majority of people say they prefer microloans and cash, but when forced to choose through the experiment, these actually have a small or negative effect in the case of cash on preferences. So we need to be careful with what people say versus what they do. Affordability is also something we wanted to look at. So that in the survey before the DC, we asked people if they thought a clean cooking solution was affordable. And the reason is we want to see if people do think it's affordable, does a subsidy help? And then, as you can remember, I think we had about 41% said it was very affordable in Isiolo, and then I think a further 27% said somewhat affordable. It was much, much smaller in Nairobi, but we want to see what all these people who think it's affordable, in theory, a subsidy may not work that well because they already think it's affordable. But we actually saw, so the orange line is the one I'm interested in looking at. In terms of subsidy, you can see it doesn't really quite, I mean, it goes up, it has an effect, but doesn't quite, like increasing the subsidy doesn't quite get them to buying the stove. So they already think it's affordable, but I guess they don't want it for another reason. And that's why subsidizing it doesn't really seem to work. And then lowering the price sort of helps, but not as aggressively as people who don't think it's affordable. The modality doesn't seem to have or delivery doesn't have almost any effect. So the question here is, there are so many people in that survey who said it was affordable. What do you do about them? And so just something to think about when designing end user subsidies. And this brings us to kind of the barriers to clean cook stoves. So they may not all be related to, I guess, affordability and price. So when we asked people what the top, decision factors were, cost came up a lot. So on the right, you see these tables for Nairobi and for Isiolo, and we have cost in bold letters. So these are the top 5, and 55%, for example, of people in Nairobi cited the cost of fuel. I mean, here it's the cost of the fuel, not the stove, and we're subsidizing the stove, so it's not necessarily addressing that. But the availability of fuel also played a role. But basically, this is saying that affordability, I mean, cost is up there, but there are other things that may prevent people, and if you know, that a subsidy may not be able to overcome. What about those people who say they want to buy a clean or improved cook stove? So we wanted to see how subsidy played a role. So we asked people in the survey before the DCE, are they interested in buying a clean or improved cook stove? And the yes are the dark blue curve. And you can see that this on the subsidies, it doesn't take much to get them quite high. From the 50% mark, you're increasing to 60 and they shoot up in terms of their choice probability of purchasing. They're also quite sensitive to price at the lower end. So again, that's a finding that's interesting, because if you're just targeting for that, one can experiment with very targeted subsidies. If you're just looking for those people who already want cook stove, you can do a lot with subsidies. Another thing we looked at is health. And the reason is we did that is that it came up, we did a max diff and asked people of the benefits of the value of clean cooking, and health came out as basically a top factor in both Nairobi and Isiolo compared to other things like environmental factors or technology adoption or time savings. So we wanted to see if people who cared about health or who had health conditions were basically reacted differently, had different behaviors in terms of choices as others, and the answer is that they do not. And then finally, we did a lot of work over gender. There were a lot of nuanced and complex findings there. I'm just showing you a snapshot of kind of one of the models we ran that did show that males were more price sensitive, and also that they're more indifferent to delivery methods, whereas women were more likely to take up an option that had financing. So that basically wraps it up in terms of the analysis. I'll just do a few takeaways for you. So not just a snapshot of whatever could fit in a few bullets. So basically DCEs can help find combinations of attributes. So attributes being price, subsidy level, modality, etc., that will lead people to adopt subsidies. It can find inconsistencies between what people say and do. So we see, John showed the evidence that it had a bit better predictive ability than other methods, and we saw some contradictions with some of the other methods we used. It limits subsidy design risk. So designing by intuition maybe doesn't work all the time in terms of understanding how people make choices. So it basically reduces the risk of related to how we expect people to behave, not being intuitive, sorry. And then as I showed you, it could lead to more optimal designs that allow you to reach more people with a given budget. In terms of behaviors, I mean, I think one that's really, I guess, striking is in these findings was that people don't think in net prices, and they're way more swayed by subsidies than prices. Financing can tip the scale towards adoption. Cash transfer seems to be less preferred, but then for both of these, there are differences in rural versus urban, so not to generalize these findings necessarily. So basically that's it. We'll be answering questions, and I would also like to invite you to get in touch with me if you are interested in using discrete choice experiments in your end user subsidies for clean cooking. We're looking at some lightweight technical assistance to programs that are interested in using this method, sharing our experience and helping out with setting things up and analyzing the results. So please do get in touch with me. But with that, we have some questions which we will answer now. So I will remove the shared screen.
Jean-Louis, I did speak to a few to the best that I could that were in
Okay.
the chat. We have one from Q&A that you might want to address,
Okay.
but I
Um,
you might review to check behind me on anything.
okay. Yeah, I haven't read would you, John, would you like to speak to a few to share with some of the most, the ones that captured you the most?
There's only a few. So the one I'm not familiar with, but I have to go back and look, and this is not uncommon, is Daniel's question about what part of Nairobi did the sample come from? And I believe we have lat long on that, so I can dig into that and see. The question, did you find any relation coherence between the preferred 60% subsidy and calculated money savings? I went back and looked at how we introduced the concepts and ideas. We did frame all of the ideas around the delivery modality. So first things first, the familiarity with subsidy was like nearly everybody in both markets. So we didn't have an awareness problem there. So that was good. When we framed up the delivery modality and all of the different attributes and levels about that, we gave a pretty clear description. What we didn't do was speak to the question here is, did you look at the cost savings and the like, which I've done in other studies to throw in as almost like a lifetime value. I just recently did this for Michelin tire company. They were looking at saying, what is the value for each additional month that we give you on the tread life of your or every 5,000 miles on the tread life of your tires. And there is a drastic impact in how folks do evaluate the lifetime value of that. Where I would somewhat counter that is there is an optimization, and Jean-Louis, you spoke to this specifically around net price had this somewhat inflection point, almost kind of at the lip of 60%, which I've seen in a lot of other verticals as well. But I did want to hit on that. We did introduce the idea of the cook stove as LPG gas stoves are attached to a gas cylinder and burn the gas on a stove, such as the one in the image that we provided. They emit less emissions, emit no smoke, and are safer than the traditional cook stoves are cooking on fire. So that's how we introduced the idea. We did not get into any benefits because we wanted to keep the benefits within the experiment so that we could directly measure them. And then another question here about there's been some talk where the president was misquoted about providing cheaper LPG options. I went and looked at the methodology, and we did this work in Q1. I went and did a quick Google search, and it looked like the misquote was sometime around the end of the prior year. So while we don't know kind of a pre or post or anything related to that, one thing I do know in other verticals is when we see somebody of some level of authority, whether it be or some decision that comes down that the media covers, what it tends to do is drive awareness and some skew of familiarity about where they heard it and why and what's relevant to it. But ultimately, what tends to be the thing that most keeps preference grounded is the net of the household wallet. So we don't know for certain that it had a significant impact, but I can tell you from prior studies in multiple verticals that tends to be the one that holds the most constant.
Thanks, John. And I have also a question that has been relayed by Jenny on regarding the progressive subsidy, which means that we can reduce the subsidy amount if the progress of the expected results shows significant improvements, how this scheme can be applied in this case. So that's interesting. In theory, because you're hitting a more optimal subsidy from the beginning, you wouldn't need to change it over time as much as a subsidy program that doesn't use this type of evidence. And we see a lot of subsidy programs that actually tweaking the parameters a year or 2 years after because they're not hitting it. And so that's a lot of time wasted and kind of fewer households impacted. You could still do a progressive subsidy, but the idea is you would be more on the mark and more efficient, and there would probably be less of a need to do that when you're using this method. That's kind of my guess, but I've not seen this used with a progressive subsidy. So another question, can this be applied to smart LPG distribution that is pay as you go? So that's interesting. So we applied this to subsidizing a stove and not a fuel. In clean cooking, we see a lot more subsidies focused on the stove, like the vast majority focused on the stove rather than the fuel, although the fuel for LPG is incredibly important. I mean, it's much more than the price of the stove, so it's pretty critical. You would be able to use it as well. There's no reason why you wouldn't be able to use this as well to price basically your subsidy on the fuel. And it's been used in many other sectors for services that you use sort of recurrently. So if you see it like healthcare or transportation, and so there's no reason it wouldn't be applied. It couldn't be applied to the a pay-as-you-go scheme. So then another question, can you unpack the hypothesis or reason as to why there was preference of cash transfers in rural households versus urban? John, I think we had something on that. Now I can't recall.
Yeah, I'm reviewing now.
Yeah.
So my gut was, I remember we had this discussion that there was a trust issue there, and now I'm reviewing it back in there is some reflection on prior study that there was some negative experiences with installments, and they've often perceived as more expensive in the long run, the fear of hidden costs, and I've seen this in other verticals as well as fear of devices stopping to work, has made many people shy away from this mode of payment. That's one of those things that I'll look back on, and I'll look at some other see if we can more inform that specifically. But it's because it's well worth noting because of how significant the differences were there.
Another one, what assumptions were made on affordability gap, socioeconomic status to get to the tipping point? So we didn't have the exact income just because we knew it's heavily biased and incorrect when we asked that question. What we did have is unemployment or employment status. From what I remember, there was no effect, right, John, of employment status on any type of choice. So that was really interesting, but yeah, maybe something to investigate some more on as to why. And then unemployment being a sort of proxy maybe for socioeconomic status, but maybe there's more to that needs to be looked into. Okay, any other questions? Is this approach scalable? So that's an interesting question. So what you need to, so I mean, basically what it is it's an experiment that you do in lieu of just a survey where you're asking people, you actually walk them through an experiment where they have tablets, and it's not a hugely time-consuming or expensive experiment because it's still somewhat of a simulation. So whether you want to use it or not depends on what your likely expected gains are. So if you have a very small subsidy, the cost of the experiment is likely to be higher, maybe, than the amount of subsidy you can save. But I showed you the example with $1 million, where in ECOLO you could purchase 100,000 more stove. I mean, that's huge, right? That's like 100,000 households multiplied by 5, you know, if you're looking at the number of people per household being impacted. And so even if you have an experiment that costs you, I don't know, a few tens of thousands of dollars, like $20,000, let's say, just I'm putting that number randomly, that's worth it because you're just getting that much more impact. So yes, it's scalable. It's not rocket science. You need people like John who know how to do this, but it's not sort of as John showed this. There is a history behind this. These things have been around for a number of decades, so it's not experimental or new methods. They've just not really been applied in the sectors we're looking at here. So I would say they're scalable, but I would say actually they're more usable when you have scale than when you don't. If you have a tiny subsidy, it just not be worth the cost benefit to do it. The next one, have any recent studies in mind that are designed at design aspect that reduce the failure of cooking solutions? The failure of cooking solutions. So basically, in terms of having people start using a clean cooking solution and then they stop using them because there's a failure because of a design flaw. I'm not aware of a study that consistently looks at that. In fact, in the clean cooking sector, there's too few studies on failures, which is an issue in the sector because lessons aren't necessarily learned and then they get sort of reproduced by others. But yeah, that's a very valid question. Then how can this be applied to informal settlements in urban areas? So, John, can you think of a spin on this that would have to be used if it's an informal settlement in an urban area versus a rural area as we did it, or an urban sort of formal area? I can't immediately think of a.
Are we talking about from a data collection methodology standpoint? Or
Yes. Yes.
It's one of the things that I don't think we were as confident in until we got to the other side was the level of familiarity and awareness that people had around the attributes and the levels that we had. I have seen in many environments, people walking around with posters and somebody taking notes, and it's like, okay, let's do this in 5 questions, and it's ABC, ABC, ABC. Okay, tabulate. I've actually done field work like at trade shows and at like a lot of intercept work where we've been able to do that. The key is optimizing your design, and the good news is, since we've already done a few of these, we know the best way in which we would need to do that. So the more attributes and levels you reduce, the easier it is to do something at that level.
Yeah, so it could be done in a very low tech way that's kind of not as organized as what I showed with the
as long as the data is entered correctly, then
yeah.
That tends to be the biggest challenge.
All right, I think we are at the end of the webinar. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, John, first of all, for being the powerhouse between the methodology and all the great findings we had. And thanks to all of you for attending. Really appreciated the questions and the opportunity to share. Again, please get in touch if there's any interest in using this. If you have an end user subsidy you want to roll out and you have any interest in using this, I'm sure we can find a way to work with you, help you. And yeah, looking forward to get this out and more widely used in this in end user subsidies and clean cooking and other sectors. All right. Thank you very much. Jenny, anything or Brenda, anything from your end to wrap up?
Nothing from my end, just thank you everyone, and thank you John Louis, and thank you John Christensen.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.